I know the last episode I did on this channel was turning something into more monstrous versions of themselves, in that case using DreamWorks animated characters, but I figured at this point I've made people wait long enough to do another episode of my singing monsters turned into monstrous fantasy beast versions of themselves. It's still one of the things I get most requested to go back to, and people have given me so many great suggestions on the previous videos in this series, including asking me to try out a Wublin, so let's get into it, shall we? Let's go.
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. My efforts to aid the monsters of song in regaining their past, positive, more musical demeanor and decreasing the likelihood of them attacking humans has slowed somewhat in the last weeks, as I've had many other tasks to contend with. It can be difficult managing my time as the overseer of my world, as many people and places could use my assistance at any given moment, to a point where it can be somewhat overwhelming. So I have had a hard time finding ample hours to go seeking the creatures of song. Still, when the time is available, I've made sure to look into more tales of other creatures I could aid. One that I was just recently directed towards is one of the strangest I've seen yet. Not so far in that it is an elaborate biological marvel like some of these creatures are, but this one simply because it appears as little more than a mouth, with fur and jagged teeth. While it appears to be able to do little besides sit in place and snarl at passers-by, that is actually what makes the frigid-flushed maw quite dangerous. Wanderers of the cold mountains on which it rested had strayed too close to the creature, believing it unable to harm them from a distance. But it has a surprisingly long tongue that is capable of stretching out to hit explorers off the mountain to their unfortunate demise. One explorer is also believed to have been devoured by the creature, as evidenced by the red-tinted snow found around it. To maintain my own distance, I remained astride my dragon ally Violet and flew just close enough to get the creature's attention. It did lash its tongue out towards me, but didn't get close enough to cause concern. I sang to the creature as I have done so with so many of the others, and after a few verses, it started to calm, as expected, and even sing along, though not in our language, mind you. To my great surprise, the creature actually had a high-pitched voice. From its rotund appearance, I envisioned it having a deep baritone, more akin to that of the overgrowth bellow ent. Beyond that, this encounter was fairly simple as far as those I've had with the creatures of song, though I have also had more truly unusual and life-threatening experiences with them as of late. Now this moldy chewed up piece of bubblegum I knew was going to be fun and a challenge, I think in the same way that I probably talked about the furcorn in the last episode, where it's a very simple design, but this one even more so than the furcorn. The furcorn actually had legs and more of a face. The maw, which was requested by a whole bunch of people, is literally just a fluffy mouth. So one thing I knew I had to do was really make the mouth more monstrous, having multiple rows of teeth, which is usually a fun addition to make something look a little bit creepier, gives slight shark kind of vibes, I guess. I also did consider giving it eyes, and I was pulling inspiration from the epic maw as well, which does have eyes, but I kind of wanted to push myself and be like, no, that's too easy of extra details to add. Let's try and stick closer to the original maw design and see how detailed I can make this without adding that. And I pulled a little bit of inspiration from mimics from Dungeons & Dragons, which can shift into different objects to disguise themselves, and I thought that was really good inspiration for this. It does still end up fairly simple. I kind of flesh out the boil lumps near its bottom a little bit more, and as I said, they look a little bit like chewed up bubblegum in the finished version, but I don't think that detracts from it. I think it works well enough, though I probably could have mixed in a little bit more fur in between them and around them or something. And overall, this doesn't hit the top mark of any of my favorites in this series, but for such a simple creature I was pulling from, I'm very happy with how this one turned out. The next creature I encountered was one I actually came across in going back to the ethereal mountains. This was where I encountered and aided the hissing plasmagast, and I felt it important to return and see if that creature had indeed kept up its peaceful ways. This task took longer than intended, which is often frustrating as I have many tasks to get to in protecting my world, and it was as if my growing anxiety lured to us more reason to be anxious. Well en route, Violet and I were struck right from the sky. A creature with 4 wings, large fangs, and eyes that could shift across its head bit right down into Violet's side and tackled us into a mountain. I fell off Violet, luckily onto a fairly flat ledge, and watched as my injured dragon teleported away from the beast to circle back around it. Luckily, because of all the research I'd done on the monsters of song as of late, I recognized this beast as a grumpacious fangpire. I'd heard no tales from locals about this creature, and admittedly had thought its breed to be extinct. I began trying to sing to it, but it shrieked violently, drowning out my calls. It soared down towards me with claws outstretched and clearly intended me harm. Thankfully, my injured but noble ally soared in to pin it to the side of the mountain. As the beast and Violet battled, I continued singing as loud as I could to try and get its attention and calm it, but nothing was working. I feared we may have to flee or else allow Violet to do significant harm to this creature, but that was when a louder, more electric sound rang through the mountains. Purple light started to gleam across the hillscape as the hissing plasmagast hovered into view, playing its own music. I altered my own song to try and sing along in unison, and slowly Violet was able to back off as the fangpire was lulled into a calm state. Still with a fairly fierce sneer on its face, the creature joined in singing along with the music. Many of these creatures, once swayed back to their calmer states, have donned more pleasant expressions. While we clearly had gotten this creature reformed to at least some degree, the entire time we sang with it, it maintained a scowl. Still, with confirmed evidence of the plasmagast's continued peace, and the unexpected reform of this other creature, Violet and I left the ethereal mountains to tend to my brave allies' wounds. Now with this drawing, I found I faced a problem that I've faced with plenty of dragon drawings in the past, which is doing the composition while keeping as much of the wings in the image as possible. Because with creatures the scale of the ones that I do in my fantasy monsters and dragon series, they would have to have really big wings to even remotely realistically keep them airborne, or to even just look fitting for the size of these creatures. And unless their wings are kind of folded in, that often means that their wings, if I try to keep the entirety of their wings in the drawing, the creature themselves could end up looking really small and less detailed because the wings are just taking up so much space. So I eventually, in my dragon drawings, started having the wings just spill out of the drawing, which can actually make the creature look bigger because it's like we're unable to see the entirety of this beast. But then there's also just trying to find a balance of keeping the wings in the image enough to show them as a part of this creature's anatomy, but also, you know, not having them spoil the framing of the more important parts of the creature. With a creature like this, its wings are one of the only design elements it has, because it's just a flying head with arms and 4 wings. So I felt like I had to keep more of the wings in the piece, but that also means there's a bit more empty space around it so that we could show the wings, and I'm not trying to put this drawing on blast. Overall, I'm still fairly happy with how it turned out. I think it's cool looking, the mouth is creepy, the wings turned out well enough, one of the hands might be a little bit too big, but I just don't know if I've talked about before that somewhat struggle of trying to find a balance of showing enough of a creature's wings while also composing the image nicely to show off the more important parts of a creature. Hopefully I articulated that well enough that you can get what I'm talking about and maybe relate to it if you also draw lots of dragons or creatures with wings. But again, overall, think this one's fairly cool, though I'd say one of the weaker ones of the series. But we'll contrast it with maybe the best drawing in the series next. So let's take a look at this one.
All the art from this episode will be up on the PopCross Studios Teespring store by the time you're watching this if you want to buy them as posters, but more importantly, did you know that if you don't sign up for the PopCross Studios Patreon, you will die someday? I mean, you will also die someday if you do sign up for the PopCross Studios Patreon, but if you want the time between now and then to be slightly more fun, you should consider signing up for the PopCross Studios Patreon. For $5 a month, you get access to all of the inks and high-resolution art from every episode going forward. There's also a massive backlog of over 500 inks and high-resolution art from the history of the channel, but the latest thing I've added is you get access to an experimental podcast I'm trying out called the Design Notes Popcast, where I basically do design notes for episodes that didn't get design notes on this channel, like Multiverse Tales episodes and the Lilo and Stitch SCPs episodes. There's 3 episodes out currently, but I've made one of them temporarily open to the public so you can get a sample of what it's like. I'll link it in the description. But anyway, sorry for the interruption, back into more art.
A new young friend of mine named Jake was gracious enough to come and aid in Violet's recovery, but even after her wounds were closed enough to no longer be life-threatening, she still needed ample rest. This frustrated me both in regards to the heartache of seeing my ally hurt, but also because it was one more thing slowing down the speed at which I could find other creatures to help, as well as returning to other tasks that required my attention. I stayed with Violet for the first day of her recovery, then left her be for the following week, during which time I handled a number of other tasks, including checking in with Gentleman Tyson and the other self-titled monster handlers, who'd provided me with much insight already into the Creatures of Song's history and the hymns of the Colossal's religion. They regaled me with the story of the most recent breed of Creatures of Song, created even after beasts of this kind were already being hunted into extinction. Proof of this specific breed's existence is limited, but some monster handlers swear to have seen these cavern-dwelling monsters known as Wubeasts. They are named as such because, rumor has it, they were made by the monstrous creations of Wuberox, whom I've discussed previously. While the enchanted boxes that spawned Barox's creations were buried deep underground long ago, it is believed that one, or even a few of them, were awakened, still underground where they created their own domain. Because of their dark yet vast magical potential, these monstrosities were able to create their own monstrous spawn by carving statues from the stones around them. Like themselves, the only way to awaken these new creatures to life was for them to consume the life essence of other monsters, or even simply the eggs of other monsters. This could bring them to life, and while none of them were as mighty and fierce as the beasts made by Wuberox, they are still vicious monsters that could bring great terror upon the surface if they ever dug their way up to us. The handlers showed me depictions of some of these creatures, and they do look far more unusual than ones I've seen thus far. One seemed to have dozens of furry apples in place of its eyes, thought possibly even to be the young of a furry warblecorn. It was both frightening, yet difficult to look away from, as it did also have many traits of creatures I find to be very intriguing, such as amphibians and Tyrannus-type beasts. The discoverer of the creature clearly felt the same, as they called it a Brumphibinos. The handlers themselves were debating whether to seek out these underground caverns, as there were rumors of where an entrance could be found, but I cautioned them to be very wary of what could happen if they did descend into those depths unprepared. Now this drawing I knew was the headliner, not necessarily because it was the most requested drawing for this third episode, but because it was the one I was most excited to do, and I had gotten some requests for doing a Brump. And like I wrote in Tayron's lore, like Tayron likes, I really like Tyrannus-type characters, anything that's got a bit of a T-Rex sort of shape to it, and amphibian creatures usually means I can give it a really slimy, shiny sort of look, which I think is one of the textures that looks best in my art style. And the other fun element to work with was going to be the lightning in behind the creature, inspired by the Wublin Island. But that was also a bit of a tricky thing to balance, because lightning is a very bright element, and usually the brightest element in a piece is what's going to draw someone's eye, and so I had to make sure to do the lightning in a way where it did look like bright, sparky, shiny lightning, but wasn't taking our attention away from the main focal point being the creature's head and the core part of its body. I end up redoing the lightning at one point to make it work a little bit better with the composition. I was pretty sure at some point I was going to have to play around with it more, but the way I end up putting it in, I think ends up looking really cool. It helps frame the character instead of drawing our eyes away from it. And the other element of this was I knew I wanted to draw this underground because the Wublin Island looks like it's underground in a cavern, and for the lore it was going to be more fitting. But I almost considered drawing it above ground because I just like how my above ground elements design-wise look more so than what I've managed to achieve rendering underground cave sort of looks. But when I thought about that, I was like, okay, why do I want to draw this above ground? It doesn't make sense for the lore that I've written. I thought about it and I was like, it's literally just because I'm nervous about not doing a good job. So I was like, okay, well, that settles it. I have to do this thing underground because this is obviously something that I have to practice in terms of drawing so I can get more confident with it. Though once I got the lightning in there, I realized it wasn't really going to work to put even more details of the caverns in behind because it was the lightning was a detailed enough element for the background, and I didn't want to detract from that at all. So overall, even though there was a bunch of uncertainty going into this one, I knew I was really confident with how the creature was going to turn out. I love how all the elements of this turned out, and I think it's at least in the top 2 drawings of this series, if not my new favorite. And I hope you all like it as much as I do, so let's take a look. While I was processing what I'd learned from the monster handlers, they invited me to join them on a mission to calm a creature of song that had been spotted on the shores nearby. It was one of the more well-known of these creatures, called the Great Jubalrus. As likely suspected from the name, they are related somewhat to walruses, though much larger and with horns and tusks through which they can play beautiful music. Of course, this creature's song had not been heard in many years, hence our quest. The journey to these shores took an hour or so on horseback, and I must say riding a horse made me appreciate how smoothly Violet can fly. Still, it was a generally pleasant journey, and it wasn't long after reaching the shores that we found the creature, as it was in pursuit of a group of fleeing travelers. Before I was even off my horse, the handlers had their instruments out. They played and very quickly slowed the creature's rampage. The handlers were playing a song I'd never heard, but it was clearly the perfect one to be playing for this creature. It began playing its horns in line with the song immediately, and even those who'd been running from it moments ago joined us in rejoicing in the music. One of them even ran to a nearby caravan to bring the rest of their clan, and soon there were a few dozen people swaying and dancing to the songs. Seeing how quickly the handlers had managed to calm this beast actually calmed me even more so. Well, I have at times caused myself anxiety by thinking of how many people need my help. Doing so often makes me forget that I'm not the only person out there trying to make the world a better place, and I don't have to do everything myself. In this case, the monster handlers are clearly even more well-equipped for this mission than I am. While I'll still certainly find time when I can to help more of these creatures, I am very comforted knowing that the monster handlers are doing this work, and helping in their way to make our world as a whole a better place. Now, I don't really know what has compelled me with this specific Fantasy Beast series to make it a bit of a blend between lore and story, where Tayrin actually has a little bit of an arc in this episode, but I think it's been a fun little shift from my usual Fantasy Beast format and the usual lore format, where I'm just talking about what the creature can do, where it came from, and that sort of thing. But anyway, going into the actual art, I realized that it had been a long time since I had done one of my drawings where we have a aquatic creature partially above water and partially underwater, and I really love that look, so I was super excited when I realized that this was going to be a good opportunity to do that. I think I've only done that 3, maybe 4 times on the channel before, so I actually forgot my formulas that I'd come up with for drawing that sort of thing, so I was kind of rediscovering that as I drew this, but I think it comes together really nicely, and I think this is one of my best examples of it. The streaks of light going under the water look really cool. The actual part where we transition from above water to underwater, I think, is a really nice, fun element. The only downside of doing this format is to make the above water and underwater atmospheres look significantly different enough. I kind of have to wash out the details of stuff that's underwater and add a bit of a blue hue to it and fade out the stuff that's a little bit farther away or deeper under the water. That can take more details out of the piece than I'd like, but I think that can also be kind of contrasted by the bubbles being added in around the creature while it's underwater. And I think the added benefit of just having two contrasting atmospheres is good enough to kind of counter any negatives that come from having to wash out some of the details. Also, I did take more inspiration from sea leopards for this than walruses, even though it's obviously a much more walrus-inspired creature. That's partially because sea leopards are one of my favorite kinds of animals, and I just wanted to work in elements of that, and also because I may or may not have been deeply traumatized as a kid by a certain walrus in an episode of a show called Pingu. And if you know what I'm talking about, you really know what I'm talking about, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, I don't even know if I want to tell you to look up the walrus from Pingu, because I don't want to traumatize people. Anyway, quite pleased with this one. I hope you all like it as well. Let's take a look at how it finished up.
I think I'd call that a pretty satisfying third episode of My Singing Monsters Made More Monstrous. Also, if you've said to yourself from looking around me, hey, what's Christian doing in South Carolina? I would then say, wow, you're incredibly good at guessing people's locations based on very little information, hypothetical person. But basically, since I can work from anywhere, my dad and I have rented a place down in South Carolina for 5 weeks, and I'm gonna be making my videos from here. Still figuring out my lighting setup a little bit, so it might change looks-wise a little bit, but, you know, it'll be similar to this. Anyway, if you're new to the channel, you might want to check out the other My Singing Monsters Made More Monstrous episodes, or maybe the DreamWorks animated characters Made More Monstrous video. But besides that, that's all for today, except, of course, for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and the thought I want to leave people with today is the idea that every struggle you face down the road to a big dream is just there to remind you how badly you want it. If you're going after something really big and even intimidating, there's going to be lots of times where you feel like life just slaps you in the face. But you just gotta remember that the reason this dream you're going after is so intimidating or is considered very difficult to achieve is because most people, when they got that slap, they just go down and give up. You have to just push through it and keep going, knowing that the victory at the end is so incredibly worth it. I hope that's inspiring to someone out there. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.